We turn our attention now to analysing George in section 3, and it's really interesting that Slim and George first off come into the darkening bunkhouse together. It shows an equality, it shows an understanding between the two men, and shows obviously that they are kind of better suited to each other. As earlier when he was walking with Lenny, one is in front of the other, but here there's almost an equality. And then we get an idea of George here, obviously, about how he seems to the outside world. As Slim says, funny how you and him string along together, because obviously it's awkward for them to be. It's awkward to everyone else that there's two guys travelling around another. Maybe it's out of jealousy. People say it. Obviously, Slim wouldn't say it that way, but he's just highlighting the fact that socially it's not something that's always done, and he actually emphasises that again. He says, "Well, I've hardly never seen two guys travel together." So again, it's a very rare occurrence to people. And after Slim compliments him, he actually says, and saying that you look quite smart. And then here we actually see some of George's own frustrations in his own life. He says, well, if I was smart, I'd have my own little place and I'd be doing my own crops instead of doing all the work and not getting what comes up out of the ground. So basically he's saying, well, I'm not smart enough to look after myself yet. I'm not smart enough to be self-sufficient. And he actually gets quite frustrated by that, because he actually sits and falls silent. And that's really interesting, because it tells us a lot about not only George, how he's feeling right then, but also maybe other things, other regrets that he has. It kind of taps into something, obviously, and it's through the silence, obviously, we're given to think that he stops and starts thinking about things that could have been different, etc., etc., etc. But we don't have the background for it, but it gives us a richer character when we're invited to think with him in his silence. Talking of his relationship with Lenny, he says, well, we got kind of used to each other after a while, after he started looking after him, after he started looking after Lenny, after his Aunt Clara passed away. And that's really interesting, that they got used to each other. He says, well, obviously we know that intellectually Lenny isn't really a match for him in any way, but it's just the idea of being used to each other, like something habitual, still something nice, something warm. And that companionship, even if it stresses George sometimes, we have to remember that this is something that not a lot of other guys have, and a lot of other guys do want. Most notably, obviously, Crooks, when he finally gets a little bit of communication, he talks about to Lenny how much he wishes he could have what him and George have, not so many words. And then we find out the control that he actually has over Lenny, because he says, if I told him to go walk off a cliff, over he'd go. So again, just kind of shows exactly how loyal Lenny would be to him. And then we find out a bit about life, about the other the other people on the ranch. They get mean, and Slim agreed, and they get so mean they don't want to talk to nobody. So again, it kind of emphasizes to us that George is in a unique situation in that he does have Lenny, and therefore he might not become that mean. And so even though we see sometimes he's got this slightly cold way towards Lenny, I think ultimately he's still got it a lot better, and he's still got a better heart than a lot of people on the ranch, or at least a lot of people that Slim's seen has come through. He talks about the money he's actually going to save with Lenny, and again, that's really important, because he's going to obviously try and get out of the situation that he's in. Me and Lenny's going to roll up a stake. So that means him and Lenny are going to save up a load of money, which, as we know, we find out a little later on, is for this ranch where they have their own land, etc., etc., etc. And so basically, this is his kind of take on his his first kind of declaration publicly to anyone apart from him and Lenny that he is actually going after his dream, the dream that we should be knowing that every itinerant worker actually says that they're going to have. We've got this line, I've just picked this one out because when he's actually told about the whorehouse and he's told about what goes on in town, he says, well, I might go in and look the joint over. So it just kind of shows, obviously he's still, it's not he's not 100% dedicated to the other idea. He could go either way. I think Steinbeck's kind of there. He could go either way, because, he could just go down that road and actually kind of get hooked in, and then, just become another dreamer. And maybe that's how so many people, again, so many itinerant workers actually, lost their way. It's just easier to get drunk and to squander the money on whores and drink than it was to actually build the savings needed to actually improve your situation. And that's interesting, because earlier on, George said, that would be an easy life. So again, it's just kind of reinforcing that he could go either way here. He says again that Lenny and me got to make a stake, and this is interesting because he says, it's structured a lot differently, even though emphasis is the same. Sorry, even though the actual message is the same, the emphasis is very different. He says we've got to make a stake. He knows this is the only way he's actually going to do anything with his life. And again, it kind of might be in companionship with that show exactly why he's so desperate to do it. Some things triggered him. He just doesn't want to be that way anymore. He tells, again, he shows that warning paternal section to Lenny. He says, Lenny, if there is any fighting, you keep out of it. Now, this isn't even a fight that Lenny has anything to do with, but it's important, again, just that he shows that he's got that looking after Lenny kind of down to a T. Here, when he's actually talking about the dream, obviously something kind of comes over him. His hands stop working the cards, even though he's shuffling cards, and his voice becomes warmer. So again, it just kind of shows the emphasis that the importance that the idea has over him. He makes him stop his, automatic responses of his shuffling cards, and his voice becomes warm. So it's almost dreamlike. That's how important it is. And then he starts talking about different parts of it. And also here is interesting. He says this is one like they had. Some of the things he wants on the ranch are actually like. I think it's pigeons flying in a certain place. But he says, I want them to be the same as like the ones that were there when I had a kid. And that's really interesting because, then he goes off into a daydream. So again, it's, literally the dream part of the American dream. He's kind of imagining this whole kind of place as best he can. And it's got a childlike wonder to him. It reminds him of his childhood. So it's really kind of insinuating to us exactly the dream qualities of the American dream. And then, and he says, and it'd be our own and nobody could can us. And again, that's the idea being represented of being his own boss. That's emphasized again straight afterwards when it says George sat entranced with his own picture. So again, like it's showing how with the word entranced, how much it's kind of overtaken him, how much he believes in it, how much it makes him feel like he's in a different place, or how much it takes him to a different place. And it's his own picture, and obviously that's quite interesting because everyone has their own dream, everyone has their own idea, and obviously you could kind of make a link to somehow this dream that he's conjuring in his head, and then obviously Curly's wife's dream in that she wants to be in the pictures. So it's kind of like dreams and life, and kind of taking place of one another. Or actually, you can draw up a comparison between them if you want. When Kenny spoke, they both jumped as if they caught doing something reprehensible, and that's really interesting because it shows us how rarely talked about the dream. How rarely kind of realized the dream is. And they know it's something for dreamers, and they don't want to seem like dreamers, even though the dreamers is actually all they have. So when Candy actually hears them, they both think they've been doing something really wrong, even though they've just been talking about something together. Or maybe it's also a reference to just the fact that they were talking together. Maybe that's not even something that's really, done. Talking intimately about something is something that's not done. That's probably actually more likely. We see his kind of caution and again his thinking when Candy offers, nearly to pay off 3/4, or I think it is 2/3 or 3/4 of the money up front. He still says, I've got to think about this, which is interesting because it just shows how defensive he is in his nature. He falls into a silence and look at one another amazed, and the thing they never really believed in was coming true. So that's really interesting. This thing they never really believed in. Maybe they were obviously aware that it was always a dream. But here they actually have a chance of making a dream a reality, and it's quite a pivotal moment, obviously, because there's a lot of traction building after this in terms of the conversation that follows, and physically it's shown in him in that his eyes are full of wonder. Obviously, we can tell that his calculating mind is just working 100 miles an hour trying to work it all out. And then he also kind of dismisses his whole life when he says, I don't want to go on just like we was going to buck barley for the rest of our lives. So he's just saying that he's going to pretend that that as if he was just like anyone else, as if he was going to just accept the fate that everyone of the itinerant workers has to actually have. When Curly comes in and actually starts battering Lenny cries out to George again because George is like a father. He turns to him straight away. He doesn't first think of defending himself. He actually just turns around and asks George for help. He says, make him let me alone, George. So he thinks Lenny shows that he thinks that George has as much control over other people as he does over himself. And then he just says to him, get him, Lenny. And that's actually really important because, again, it's just kind of like get him. He's not kind of giving him a clear response and defend yourself, punch him back. It's almost like he's talking to a dog. Get him, boy, jump, boy, sit, boy. Get him in this circumstance. So obviously, it kind of shows the animalistic side of Lenny, and obviously the base commands which George uses to command him.